I may have found the easiest way to smoke a brisket ever. It doesn't require you to probe for tenderness. It doesn't require you to stress over when you're gonna pull the brisket off of the smoker. It doesn't require you to worry when you cut into the brisket about whether it's going to be undercooked and tough or whether it's gonna be overcooked and crumble apart. But I'll be honest with you guys, this might tick some people off. This technique flies in the face of what a lot of old school barbecuers think is the right way to cook brisket. And it also might have one big disadvantage based on the results of my experiments, but you might be completely comfortable with it. And I want to be upfront with you guys about that because this technique is not perfect, not yet anyway. Guys, this is the biggest experiment I've ever done on my channel. It took 4 briskets, it took multiple months, a ton of time and effort, and I'm really excited to share it with you guys and to get your feedback. Because if I'm right about this technique, it could really simplify the way that people cook briskets, especially beginners, and allow beginners to cook perfect brisket every time, even if it's their first time. So let's get smoking. Now this video was originally intended to be 4 different experiments, 4 different videos, but I didn't want to put you guys through that, so I just consolidated it into one video, and it just works better this way because I found consistent results over all of the 4 tests that I did. So let's start with the first experiment. As I said in the intro, I want to come up with a technique for beginners to use to cook brisket so that they don't have to worry about probing for tenderness and knowing when the brisket needs to be pulled from the smoker so that it's perfectly cooked and it's not under or overcooked. I have people all the time reaching out to me and they're super stressed in the middle of cooking a brisket and they're asking me, Steve, do I probe the flat or the point? What temperature should it be? What should it feel like? It feels tender in the point, but it feels tough in the flat. It feels like the point is overcooked, but the flat is undercooked. All of these issues are really, really prevalent for beginners, and I used to have them as well. For my first 20 briskets or so, until I actually started getting a really good feel of it, I didn't really know how my briskets were gonna turn out. I probed into them. They felt tender. I did the feel test. I waited a little bit longer. I made sure they were in the right temperature zone. But it was always really stressful when it came time to serve my briskets up to my family because whenever I sliced into them, I was thinking, oh man, is this gonna be really tough and inedible or is it gonna be really dry and crumbly? I have no idea. So I was always super happy when it turned out great. But I want to eliminate that for beginners. And so in the first experiment, I got a select grade brisket, so a brisket with not a lot of fat content in it. I cut it in half. I weighed it because I'm going to weigh the weight before and after to see how much moisture each half loses with each different cooking technique. In the first stage, I cooked the brisket halves exactly the same way. I cooked them on my offset smoker until they reached about 180 degrees Fahrenheit and the bark was where I wanted it. I wrapped them in tallow soaked butcher paper. I put one in the oven just to hold it at 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Because I know how my oven works, I actually set my oven to 185, non-convection mode, so it won't dry it out. And that really holds the temperature of the brisket at 165. And I took the other half of the brisket and I put it in my Masterbuilt electric smoker and I finished it all the way up to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. The one that I probed for tenderness and finished normally at 203, that was done. It's like all my other briskets. And the one that held overnight, I held it for approximately 14 hours until lunch the next day. And here are the results of those 2 tests. We've got 113 ounces starting weight, 59.5 ounces end weight. So that's a 53% loss of moisture throughout the entire cooking process. That's pretty substantial. So let's cut into it and see what it looks like. It's got some pretty dry edges on the flat. Take a look at that. Pretty dry, but pulls apart perfectly. I mean, it's perfectly cooked. It's just a little bit dry. So let's take a taste of it. It's got really good flavor. This is the kind of bark I dream of. This is great bark. That's good brisket. I mean, I could eat that all day. It's just a little bit on the dry side because it's a select grade brisket. Doesn't have a lot of fat in it. Pretty good though. All right guys, now I've got the long rested brisket here. This long rested brisket lost exactly the same amount of moisture as the brisket that we cook normally. So I'll slice into this guy. This is a lot more crumbly than the other one. It is crumbling apart much more easily. Looks pretty decent. Again, there's still fat in the seam fat coming out, but the point on either side looks a little bit dry. Not as good as the other one. It's a little bit tougher. It's not undercooked though. It's still pull apart. It's really good. The point is amazing. It's just the flat is super dry. The other thing though is if you look at this this fat is super well rendered. It just kind of falls apart. It's almost just melting. It's super rendered and it tastes phenomenal. So that extra time in the oven must have done a really good job at rendering this fat a lot more. So after the first experiment was done, I knew that cooking a select grade brisket was just not gonna work very well with this method. The long held brisket that I held at 165 overnight was dry. The bark was still good, but it just didn't have enough fat in it to really survive that long hold period. So I thought, well, a lot of the people that hold their briskets for a long time in Texas, like a lot of Texas barbecue joints, they hold their briskets after they're done at 150 degrees Fahrenheit overnight until it's time for meal service. And that usually results in a better brisket. But they're usually using a lot higher quality briskets when they hold their briskets for that long. So what I did is I got the highest quality brisket that I could have ever got in my area. It's a Wagyu brisket from Brant Lake Wagyu, and it's got the most fat content of any brisket I can get in my local area. I did the exact same test that I did in the first experiment, cut the brisket in half, I weighed each half of it, and then I smoked it on my Oklahoma Joe's smoker up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit on each half of the brisket. I put one in the oven to hold overnight at 165, and I put one in the Masterbuilt electric smoker at 275 degrees Fahrenheit to finish all the way up to 203. And when I say 203, it's not done right at 203. I'm probing it, I'm feeling it. It might take a half an hour after that. It might hit 203 and I dial it back down to around 225 degrees Fahrenheit and kind of hold it at 203 for half an hour until it's really probe tender and it's exactly at the place where I know it's going to be a perfectly cooked brisket. It's not overdone or underdone. So I'm doing my real best job to make that 203 brisket a really good control brisket to gauge how well the 165 held overnight brisket turns out. And here are the results of experiment number 2. The starting weight was 5.39 pounds, end weight 2.88 pounds. That works out to a 47% loss of moisture. Waterfall test passes. Lots of juice, lots of moisture. Pulls apart nice and easily. It's got a little bit of tug, but it pulls apart really nice. So it's perfectly done. The fat is really well rendered. You can see I can just squish it. Nice sugar cookie bark. So this is a perfect brisket. It's usually how I cook my briskets. All right, now for the taste test. It's good. It's real good. It's juicy, it's tender, the bark is perfect, it's got really good flavor. These Brant Lake Wagyu briskets are amazing. It's really hard to screw them up, but they're super juicy. I love this brisket. It's so good. So I don't see how a long rest could improve over this, but now we're going to test the long rest brisket and see if it's even better than this one. Okay, so this brisket that rested overnight lost 43% of its total weight. This brisket retained more moisture than the one that I cooked to 203, which is the opposite of the results that I found when I was testing this exact same test with a select grade brisket. This brisket was rested down to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, just like brisket I did before, or the other half of the brisket. Lots of juice, I think a lot more juice in that seam fat at least. Oh man, that's so good. It's a lot different than the one that I cooked up to 203 degrees in the oven and didn't hold overnight. Now, at this point, I knew a lot more than when I started. I knew that a high fat content brisket is definitely needed for this technique. A select grade brisket really isn't gonna work. And with the Wagyu brisket, I found that the results of the long hold method versus the all the way up to 203 normal method were pretty comparable. They were almost the same, but I did find that the long hold method resulted in a little bit drier of a brisket, just by a little bit. But for most people, they wouldn't even recognize that difference. But I really wanted to confirm that. I really wanted to make sure that these results weren't just random or there was some sort of variable that I hadn't accounted for. So I decided to test it on another brisket, a pastrami or Montreal smoked meat brined brisket that I was making for my son's birthday party to serve up to guests. I decided to also do a third experiment where I cut that brisket in half, I weighed it, and I cooked it the exact same way that I cooked the previous 2 briskets, and then I compared the results of the 203 method versus the long hold overnight 165 method. All right, round 3, and I'm now wearing my Body by Brisket shirt because at this point I'm made up of like 90% brisket. I've eaten so much of it. Okay, this brisket lost 38% of its moisture. Okay, so I sliced up the point and I'm gonna do a quick taste test here. Holy It's so juicy. It's amazingly juicy. Like, the brine has really helped maintain a lot of moisture in this brisket. And with the rub and the smoke and the salt, it's just an amazing piece of brisket. Now let's do the brisket that was held overnight at 165, and we'll see if it's even better than this one. I don't know how it could possibly be better, but we'll find out. The one that was held overnight in the water, it lost more moisture overall, more weight than the brisket that we finished up to 205. So those are the results that I got. Bark is really nice. The fat looks pretty well rendered. It doesn't look as well rendered as the one I finished up to 203. Well, actually, it does, actually. I'll take that back. It looks really well rendered. Do a pull test. It pulls apart perfectly, just like the other one. It's so good. Just like the other briskets that I cooked this way, it's got a little bit more resistance on the teeth. The meat has a little bit more beefiness to it and resistance in the actual meat. So that shows that the overnight hold method at 165 is capable of cooking a perfect brisket without having to probe at all. The one thing I would say though is this is consistent with the last brisket that I did and the first select grade brisket that I did. The overnight hold method seems to produce drier results than just finishing it up to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Guys, I wanted to take a minute to talk about this device that I wouldn't have been able to do these experiments without. This is the ThermoWorks Signals that ThermoWorks was gracious enough to send me, and it works awesome. It's got 4 probes that plug into it. One of them is an ambient temperature probe. It looks a little bit different. It doesn't have as pointy and long of a probe. So I can monitor my temperatures in my offset smoker really easily. I can monitor the internal temperature of the meat, and it sends it right to this device, which also relays it via Bluetooth and Wi-Fi so that I can get it on my phone. Really handy because I like the Bluetooth because you can use it at barbecue competitions, other people's houses where you don't necessarily have Wi-Fi. And when you're in the basement or when you're away from your home getting some groceries while the offset smoker's going or your pellet smoker's going, whatever you have, you can look on your phone and see the temperature because it's connected to the Wi-Fi, connected to the cloud. And if you have no signal, then you can see it from other areas of the house, which I find really helpful because when I'm off taking care of my son, I don't always get signal on Bluetooth purely only devices that I use to monitor temperature on my smokers. Awesome device, really highly recommend it. I've been using ThermaPen for years, which I use as my daily instant read thermometer, but the ThermoWorks Signals is an awesome addition as a remote probe thermometer. If you need something that is both wireless in terms of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on your internet, it's super accurate. It just makes it really easy to monitor both your ambient temperature, especially on your offset smoker, and the internal temperature of the meat. The other great thing is you can log temperatures and send them directly to your phone and download them via CSV. If you're a nerdy dad like I am and you want to see the data, and you want to compare your cooks versus the data on your last cooks. Really handy, especially for someone like me that's doing experiments. Highly recommend it, guys. I'm gonna link it in the description section below if you guys wanna pick one up. Now, after the third experiment, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I almost quit the experiment and decided not to do a video at all and just have a sunk cost for all these briskets and just leave it where it is. But I decided that I wanted to do one more test because something really important happened. I did another experiment, and there's a video out on this that I did a while back. I'll link it here. It's a pork butt that I cut in half, and one half I did all the way up to 203, and the other half I held overnight at a lower temperature. And it turned out that the long hold method for the pork butt resulted in a better result than the 203 finished regular method. And that, in my mind, is because what I did is I added liquid into the pan and I covered the pan tightly with foil. So that pork butt, the half that was held overnight at 165, it didn't have the opportunity to dry out. But with these other experiments, the 3 initial experiments I did with brisket, I hadn't added any moisture back in. So I sweated out a lot of that moisture when I got them up to 175, 180 before wrapping them, and they didn't have much moisture left to suck back into them during that long hold and subsequent rest period. So that was what I thought at the time might have been a reason for the long hold method being drier than the regular 203 method. So what I decided to do is one more experiment, and this time what I did is I got a prime grade brisket, so a lot of fat content. It's an Angus brisket though, not a Wagyu brisket. I cut it in half, prepared it like all of the other experiments that I did. I used my Traeger this time, but that's just because I needed a more convenient method. I'm back at work now. I'm working full time trying to get these videos out. I had to use the pellet grill this time, but that shouldn't make much of a difference because we're cooking them both on the pellet grill, so the results should be consistent. So after the brisket got up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, I did the exact same thing as the other 3 experiments. I wrapped them both, but this time I wrapped them in foil, in a foil pan, and I added a little bit of beef stock back into the pans. I finished one of them up to 203 until it was probe tender, same way as the other briskets that I finished. The other pan I finished in the oven overnight. I held it for about 14 hours at 165 degrees Fahrenheit, and the results of that experiment were a little bit interesting. I invited a friend over because you guys don't just have to take my word for all of these experiments and taste testings. I wanted to get someone in that was kind of a third party and would be able to give another opinion about whether he thought the long hold method was juicier or less juicier than the 203 regular method. All right, guys, I'm here with my friend Blair, and what we're going to do now is we're going to taste test the one brisket half that I cooked overnight and held at 165 and test it versus the regular brisket that I finished up to around 203 degrees. So in total, it lost about 50% of its mass, so 50% of its moisture. So it looks pretty good. It's got a really nice smoke ring, actually. It's really tender. Like, is it dry at all to you?
No, not at all.
So here's a piece of the point. So we got the point muscle here. Pull that apart. Pulls apart pretty nice. Give that a taste.
Oh man, that's good brisket. So well marbled. The first piece had maybe a little pot roasted, but not dry. The piece I just had was really good.
So from the flat, it was a little bit pot roasty, but not dry.
No, but the point was like perfect.
So let's put this to the side and take out brisket half number 2. So this one lost 41% of its weight.
Your other piece did either.
It pulls apart just as easily. It's definitely drier.
Yeah.
It looks drier from like my.
Yeah, from your angle it does.
Yeah, it does.
The fat is probably more well rendered. It seems like the overnight method in general isn't, these are consistent results that I've had for all of the 4 briskets that I have cooked with this method. They are a little bit drier than just the regular briskets that I cook up to 203. Just the 2-hour rest with regular brisket finished up to 203. That seems to be the best way that I've found to cook brisket so far.
The traditional cooked one was better, but if the overnight method was like way easier to do, the difference wasn't that. It was a very, very small difference. Both were pretty delicious.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm splitting hairs. So
yeah, for the average person that's going to eat both these briskets, they probably wouldn't notice a difference. Someone that doesn't eat a ton of brisket and they're not like,
yeah, like exactly, 100%.
All right, guys, time for some conclusions. Based on these experiments, what I would say with pretty good certainty is that this is a great method to use if you're a beginner, if it's one of the first briskets that you cooked, or if you really need to nail it your first time or second time and you don't want to worry and stress about when to pull your brisket, what does probe tender mean? This is amazing. It also fits with my lifestyle because the way that this technique works is that I can put my brisket on the smoker on Saturday and really just enjoy tending the offset smoker, getting the bark where I want it, and then I can throw it in a aluminum pan covered in foil, chuck it in the oven, hold it at 165 overnight, and I have a perfectly cooked brisket at lunch the next day for a barbecue that I'm having, and I don't have to probe it. I don't have to worry about whether it's going to be underdone or overdone. The results are pretty consistent that it's just perfectly cooked every time with this method. Now, having said that, the first 3 tests that I did, I felt that there was a perceptible difference in terms of dryness. The long hold briskets were a little bit drier than the ones that I finished up to 203 and just pulled them at the perfect time and rested for 2 hours. And even my friend Blair, as you saw, said that, yeah, it's the long hold brisket was a little bit drier than the regular brisket. So I would love it if you guys tried out this method and let me know how it goes for you. You might have different results, but I'd love to know if this is an easier way to cook brisket, if the results are actually really juicy for you and the convenience trumps any perceptible dryness that you might get from using this technique. Just to summarize the entire technique, just smoke your brisket all the way up to 170, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the bark is pretty much guaranteed to be set. That's why I just say 180. And then wrap it in a aluminum pan, put about half a cup of beef consomme or beef stock in there around the sides, cover it tightly in foil, put it in your oven at 165. And to get 165 accurate in your oven, you might have to go up to around 185, maybe even 195, because depending on your oven at 185 might hit an average of 165 at that temperature, or you might have a super accurate oven and you actually have to set it to 165. But most ovens don't go that low anyway, so try 185, and if you have a remote probe thermometer, monitor the temperature of the meat. And if it's too low, let's say it's sitting at 145 when your oven is set to 185, just increase the oven temperature by 10 degrees every half an hour until you get that perfect 165 hold, and then just leave it for 14 to 16 hours. The next day, take it out and see how it goes. I'd love to hear about your guys' results. I hope this video gave you some ideas and helps you make a better brisket. If you guys would like to chat more in depth about my experiments and my techniques, consider joining my Patreon page. I'll link it in the description section below. We're building a really awesome community there, and the idea for this video actually came from one of my Patreon supporters. So thank you so much for that idea, because it's led me to a really cool place, and I love where this is going, and I'm looking forward to expanding on this technique. Thanks a lot, guys. I'll see you in the next video where I'll probably be cooking another brisket. Happy smoking.
So now you've seen behind the scenes.
What's behind the scenes? All our dirty kitchen? And
Sure, that's what life looks like.
leftovers.
It's not all perfect, guys, when you're cooking.
Sometimes you even
But it's not always how you start. The idea is how you finish.
keep going. You got any other words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, Steve's now hit 50,000 subscribers. I'll be kinder to him, and because I've always referred to him as Brisket Boy, I'll just have to be a little more kind to him now.
What are your words of wisdom, Dad? Tell me your words of wisdom.
Okay?
I'm all ears.
How come I didn't shave until I was 22? How come you got a beard? Look at that.
I don't know. I probably got more women than you because of my beard.
No, I've got rid of more women. I got rid of more women than you'll ever be with. Trust me.
Also, I want to pause and just say you've only had a beard since we've been married. I like a beard.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I got the only woman that mattered.
You said you got more women than your dad did with your beard.
Well, maybe one. I don't know.